So we know that erythropoietin, the precursor for new red blood cells, is a function. Secretion of renin is definitely a function from the juxtaglomerular cells. And then vitamin D3 activation is also a function. So the secretion of glucocorticoids is not a function of the kidneys. That is a function of the adrenal glands. And remember, the adrenal glands are actually not a part of the renal system, okay? So just bear that in mind. The renal system includes the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. So the answer here was D. Okay. All right, which of the following is not one of the three barriers that the filtrate must cross before entering Bowman's capsule? So we just described the three barriers: the capillary endothelial cell, the basement membrane, and the epithelial cell of the podocyte. So the apical membrane of tubular cells is not a part of the filtration membrane. Remember, the apical layer of the tubular cells is going to be where we start getting into the tubular structures. So the parts of the proximal tubule, which are not located at the glomerulus, okay? So C is the correct answer here because it's not a part of this barrier. All right. Okay, which of the following statements about ADH is incorrect? So let's go through these one by one. ADH stimulates the synthesis of aquaporin 2, that is correct. ADH acts on renal tubular cells by binding to receptors on the basolateral membrane, that is correct, right? So it's going to bind on that basolateral surface, bring about cellular response and the movement of aquaporin 2s to the apical surface. C, ADH is secreted by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. This is not true, right? ADH is secreted by the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And if you recall our endocrine anatomy, the posterior lobe was where we had the neurosecretory cells, so the cells that are releasing the hormones that are actually made in the hypothalamus, and that was oxytocin and ADH. And then D, inadequate secretion of ADH causes diabetes insipidus. This is true. We did not speak about diabetes insipidus, but just for a quick kind of fun fact here, diabetes can be labeled as insipidus or mellitus. And this is actually an older method of diagnosing diabetes. So back in the day, physiologists would actually taste the urine of a patient that was suspected to have diabetes. And if the urine was watery, we would call it insipidus. Insipidus means watery. And if the urine was sweet, we would call it mellitus. Mellitus means sweet. So diabetes mellitus are the diabetics that have high blood glucose because of problems with the pancreas, so insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity, whereas diabetes insipidus is diabetics who have really watery plasma and watery urine because of a lack of ADH. So this is usually brought about by pituitary tumors that are not secreting enough ADH. And so if we can't prevent antidiuresis by putting those aquaporin 2s to reabsorb water, then we simply lose all of that water in the urine and the urine becomes more watery. Okay, so really long tangent to kind of explain why this diabetes insipidus is found in people who have inadequate ADH. Okay, but the correct answer here was C. ADH is secreted by the posterior lobe and not the anterior lobe. Okay. Okay, in the renal handling of potassium, which hormone increases the number of sodium and potassium pumps on the basolateral membrane? And this was aldosterone, right? So aldosterone is a hormone that directly increases sodium reabsorption by inputting more sodium potassium pumps in the basolateral membrane, as well as those sodium and potassium leak channels independently in the apical membrane. Okay. Let's look at another here. And please feel free to stop me if any of these, if you have questions on any of these, or if you don't understand why the correct answer is so. Okay, which of the following is not a hemorrhage-induced factor that contributes to renal control of water loss in the presence of decreased mean arterial pressure? So we want to identify what the main stimulus here is. And before we even start looking at the options, let's think about what the stimulus is and what the compensation should be, what the body should try to be doing. So it's asking about hemorrhage-induced factors that would be brought about in the presence of a decreased mean arterial pressure. So here we're thinking about hemorrhage, shock, or a decrease in pressure. And so we want to think broadly about what the body would be trying to do. The body should be trying to reabsorb more water, reabsorb more sodium, and secrete more potassium. Okay, those are the three mechanisms that will help to correct this initial stimulus. So let's look at our answer options now. So decreased mean arterial pressure stimulates renin secretion. That is true. Renin is going to ultimately create aldosterone, which will influence the reabsorption of sodium directly and the reabsorption of water indirectly as a secondary function. B, decreased mean arterial pressure decreases the glomerular filtration rate. This is also true. If we decrease mean arterial pressure below 80, remember this is not that 80 to 180 window. If we go below 80, then mean arterial pressure, then glomerular filtration rate will also decrease as a mechanism to decrease the amount of water that is being lost, right? So we're now going to decrease GFR, which will decrease the urine output in an attempt to correct this initial stimulus of hemorrhage that we're correcting. C, decreased activity in venous cardiac baroreceptors, which stimulates ADH secretion. Again, let's think about this here. So if we have a decrease in mean arterial pressure, that is going to be detected as decreased activity in our baroreceptors, right? Decrease in the stretch of those arterioles or decrease in the stretch of those receptors. And that is a direct stimulus for ADH secretion. So that is one of the two stimuli that we talked about for ADH, right? Remember, baroreceptors was one, but then osmoreceptors, which detect the osmolarity of our plasma, was a second one. And then lastly, D, decreased mean arterial pressure results in increased sodium secretion into the renal tubules. And this goes directly against what we just said, right? We said that as a result of hemorrhage or shock or dehydration, we want to increase the reabsorption of sodium. And so this answer would be wrong. So this is not a hemorrhage-induced factor. Hemorrhage will not create increased sodium reabsorption. In fact, it'll do the opposite. It'll create an increase in the absorption of sodium. Okay. All right. So D was the answer here. This one's, oops, the answer showing, but this one is also pretty straightforward. Oops. The question was, the kidneys function in an acid-base balance by controlling which of the following ions, and that is hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, which we talked about earlier today. And then this question here, which of the following occurs as a result of an increase in acids in the plasma from sources other than carbon dioxide? Again, pretty straightforward. If we have a source for acid that is not the lung, so not carbon dioxide, it's going to be metabolic. And obviously, if it's acid, it's going to be an acidosis. So the answer here is metabolic acidosis. Okay.